and big hello to them, Jake and the crew over there this morning. And good morning to you, RIM Country. Chris Higgins in the studio for the KRIM Community Spotlight Program. Let me clear my throat. There we go. In the studio this morning, we have special guests from the MHA Foundation, Mr. Kenny Evans.
Good morning.
Jennifer Smith.
Good morning.
And also our intern, Ashland Whetstone.
Good morning.
Good morning, Ashland. And Ashland, her program, the intern program, sponsored by MHA Foundation. So thank you for that, guys. It's fun having Ashland in here. If you were listening, you heard Ashland on the ukulele with Rock and Ron, and was that fun jamming with Rock and Ron?
Definitely, we put it together like 5 seconds before, but I think it turned out pretty decent.
There you go, a little improv. Well, you know, Rock and Ron has been jamming in the RIM Country for, I don't want to say
Longer
how many
than
years.
she's been alive.
Oh my gosh, 4 times longer than you've been alive, I think. So yeah, it's so there we go. That's quite the collaboration, you know, the old and new collaborating right here in KRIM. Well, again, very excited to have you guys in this morning to talk about the MHA Foundation. And this morning it's a special 1-hour program. So we are live streaming on the KRIM FM Facebook page and YouTube channel. So please feel free to comment, let us know where you're watching from, say hi to us here this morning. And we're going to do a 1-hour program, the first half hour on our stream and on air, and then the second half hour just on the live stream. So again, if you want to hear the story from beginning to end, the history of MHA Foundation, Mogollon Health Alliance, and back even further, you definitely want to stay tuned in and watch the live stream. So I guess, is it appropriate to say, how about we start at the beginning, Kenny?
Well, I don't think I want to go back to A&E, but we'll start somewhere in the midstream. Is that all right?
That sounds great. That sounds great.
You know, Payson is, you know, is a historic community. It's a community that was founded here in the mountains of central Arizona back with lots of cowboys and literally cowboys and Native Americans, Indians here. And the community literally wasn't even in the location it's in now.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the first settlements were in Geisela, and then they moved west out toward Dalbaby and tried to settle out there, and again couldn't survive out there, and then ultimately moved to what was Green Valley, and then that became Payson. So many years, some 5 decades after that, why the adults who were here, most of them women, part of the group that rolled up their sleeves and said, we need health care in RIM Country, began this initiative in the 1950s. So you want to take off from there?
Yes, actually. So Chris, I actually have a printout here of an article from the Public Affairs Department. I'm not sure the Public Affairs Department of what, but it says the Public Affairs Department, and it's from...
There was no Payson. There
Right.
was no town of Payson.
Right.
It was just an unincorporated group of people living in the common area here.
So
Wow.
this article
Yeah.
was published in January of 1958, and it is entitled "No Longer the Town Without a Doctor, Payson, Arizona."
Wow.
And it talks about how the the Junior League came together, and they were just incensed at the lack of medical care. Interestingly enough, we did have at that time a pharmacist that was taking care of a lot of people, but the needs were far beyond what he could help them with. You know, he could patch people up and he could give first aid, and obviously, you know, mix some powders together.
Yeah.
But he wasn't a doctor, and so January 1958, Payson was already being talked about statewide because of their unique approach to healthcare. The town of Payson wasn't incorporated until 1973. So more than
15 years later.
15 to 20 years later. And so what's interesting is one of the things that was talked about back then was it was a unique situation, particularly in this community, because there was no incorporated town. It was just a group of people living kind of in a village.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so there was no way for the hospital to be a community hospital. It only could be a private hospital. So that's where, when we look at the long history of the organization that we're currently have the privilege to work with, there are a lot of iterations, but the original incorporation was decades before the town was incorporated. So the nonprofit had been in existence for quite a while.
And that is consistent with Payson in a lot of areas when you look back historically, you know, throughout Payson's history, where they've been kind of progressive.
Yeah.
Payson, this community, has been progressive in the sense that they identified a need and they joined together to fill that need.
Well, part of
Classic could be the water situation.
Yes.
No rural community really stepped up and developed, you know, the kind of an infrastructure that we evolved with here. And again, it wasn't a town of Payson. You know, it wasn't a municipal corporation doing it. It was the Chris Higgins and the Swartwoods and the people out here who were living in this community who said, we need more than just an individual well at each person's house, you know, sucking from a common aquifer. So whether it was water or healthcare, there was a sense of almost like frontier, you know, camaraderie, saying we roll up our sleeves and do a barn raising to help benefit the community.
Wow. And I want to point out and recognize Ashlyn's mother is a nurse at Banner Payson Medical Center.
Right.
So there's that connection with all of the nurses, everyone at Banner Payson Medical Center today, a connection back to 1959.
Actually, that was when this article was written. Originally, let's see here, 1954, I believe.
54.
Let's see, yes, the Junior Women's Club set out in 1954 to raise money to build a community clinic and attract a physician to town. This is from a letter dated 1993. That was actually written to the Arizona Hospital Association pertaining to the status of the hospital in Payson. So they were kind of giving a little bit of a historical overview.
Gotcha.
And so then it was actually, the clinic was built and opened in 1956. So if you look at that, 54 to 56, these are this is a group of really gritty women
Yes.
that were determined. I mean, they built a building in 2 years. They went from nothing, from frustration to building in 2 years.
And to have that clinic, so that connection back to 1956 when it was opened, and we're at 2022 today.
Right.
So, you know, over 65 years later, that's amazing.
Yeah, what's really also amazing too is, you know, the folks back then are no different, were no different than the folks now. And not everybody was of the same opinion pertaining to the clinic, even when it was just gonna be one person, maybe coming up 1 or 2 days a week. There were a group of people that were adverse to it. Why are we spending $250 a month to maintain a building when we don't know if we're going to get benefit out of it? And this is just a testament to human nature. It's just who we are. When there's change and when we're growing and evolving and doing things that haven't been done before in our lives and in our world, there's some fear. And so there can be some pushback, especially, you know, and it's totally understandable when you're not a part of the process. It's harder to understand the process and a little bit easier to be more fearful.
We also picked up some information. We didn't have an airport in those days, and interestingly enough, the landing strip, we'll call it the landing strip because it was never really an airport, the landing strip for the doctors who would fly in to service his clinic was a street we now call Arrow. The reason it was called Arrow, you know, continental at one end and arrow on the
Yeah,
other.
yeah.
The reason you have a gap in the middle called arrow was that was the airstrip
That was,
that the docs would land on and walk over to the clinic to, you know, to be the docs and
Oh.
resident doctors, you know, once or twice a month.
wow.
They also there were folks that did have airplanes at that time,
Uh-huh.
and for critically ill or injured patients, they would, believe it or not, life flight them out to the valley, even back in the 50s.
Back then, wow.
Back then,
Well,
yeah.
and I imagine, well, because we had the, what is it, Rim Country Historical Society
Mhm.
in here with the, or Northern Gila County Historical Society, I'm sorry, with the Rim Country Museum, Zane Grey Cabin, and they were going over the time frame of when the road was paved, when it was still dirt, when it kind of was a dirt road, became a dirt road versus just a trail.
Yeah.
And it's amazing because it was in the 50s, a
It
dirt
was.
road,
Mhm.
and so the alternative, you know, driving someone down that dirt road
Right.
or flying someone, it would be so
Well,
much faster.
It's interesting that you bring that up because they actually talk about that in that article. It was a 3-hour drive over dirt roads to Cottonwood and a 5-hour drive over dirt roads down to the valley.
Wow.
So, yeah, totally fascinating. And so apparently there are birth certificates out there for babies that were born on the road that literally say somewhere between Payson and Phoenix, Arizona. Or at the top of Mount Ord, or in
Yeah.
Sunflower.
In transit.
Entrance. Could you imagine that, Ashland? Having to, take 5 hours, taking 5 hours to go down to the valley right now on a dirt road.
On a dirt road.
Yikes.
In a
Yikes.
car. And the cars then didn't handle like they do now.
No.
So, you know,
No,
no
didn't-
power brakes, no power steering, bumpy, you know.
Bumpy, yeah. And that's where you see the pictures. Love the old pictures of the vehicles with the bladders, the water bladders
yeah.
strapped to the hood,
Uh-huh.
the spare tires. Again, they were saying that most people, they traveled with 2 spare tires
Right,
because you were going to get at least one flat coming up here.
right, absolutely. And your car's gonna overheat coming over the hills and,
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely.
I
So,
can imagine in my mind's eye what my wife would be like when she was pregnant with one of our 5 kids and there's a flat tire between here and Phoenix. Would not be a happy day.
No.
I've met Linda a number of times and I could say that's probably true.
So it's really great to look back and
Yeah.
see how this evolved.
The genesis of the need is,
Mhm.
you know, if you can put yourself there, it was very real. And these women, just like Payson's pioneers in general, were filled with grit. They were filled with determination. And I think that that's a unique characteristic to a lot of our rural areas.
Mhm.
The folks that made this place happen, they didn't do it without a lot of work.
Mhm.
And so that was how it started. And
Mhm.
they were savvy enough to even incorporate it back
Mhm.
then.
Wow.
Yeah.
So what was the next stage then of the clinic, or kind of where did it go from there?
You know, it was a clinic and then for, as she was mentioning, for about a decade and a half until Payson became a town.
Mm-hmm.
And back before I mentioned that, one thing you need to recognize is the size of Payson.
Mhm.
I have an atlas in our office that shows the size of Payson in 1950 was 315 people.
1950, 315
Wow.
people.
1960 it had doubled, so they'd had a land rush and explosion. You know, they had 100% growth in 10 years, so there were like 600 people, and I don't think we can comprehend what living in a tiny rural community would be like with 600 people
Mhm.
in the conditions they were under. So as Jennifer mentions, the likes of Anime Deming and you know,
Piles.
the Piles and the Holbrooks, you know, just family after family that you could count on, the Kleins.
Mm-hmm.
Those were really resourceful people who made, you know, laid the foundation. So
Mm-hmm.
they reached a point where they needed a doc. They needed a doctor here as opposed to one who was flying in and landing on a dirt strip and flying out.
Mm-hmm.
So we did eventually get that, and then it was actually amazing. And in these, you know, obviously we're having to compile these because I it was a couple of decades before I was even born. And so obviously all of this stuff is forensic for us, and I know Kenny wasn't raised up here either, and so, you know, we sort of stepped in relatively new to this process. So according to the anthology that I'm reading, the clinic actually grew between 1957 and 59 into a hospital complete with an emergency room and a maternity clinic. So again, another 2 years, and here we are. You know, more development with it, more growth. So obviously the need was real, because folks wouldn't have continued to grow it if that wasn't the case. And then by 1977, the hospital needed a renovation and expansion. And so when folks talk about the original hospital, that is that wing on the west side of the hospital where the admin buildings are now.
Oh, wow.
Along
Okay.
Ponderosa.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
That was the 1977 expansion.
Wow.
Yes, exactly.
Wow.
And when I moved here in '92, they were still operating. That was the hospital facility, and the emergency room was still in that same building. You went through the little sliding glass door right there next to the parking lot, and so that was, you know, that building has served for a very, very long time.
Yes.
To help meet the healthcare needs.
Wow. Yeah, that's amazing to think about that. The just the size and the size of the building that's required today for all of the current operations and services.
And as she mentioned, by the early 90s, the town had grown substantially. It was in the thousands of people that were living here, and the need for what the doctors at that time were calling a state-of-the-art hospital was clearly evident. Then as now, Payson was kind of a core area, but the larger area in northern Gila County, more than half of the people lived outside the town of Payson, just as they do today. You know, we have 35,000 people in northern Gila County, only 16 or 17,000 live in the town, so they had the same situation. It was really a regional issue, and they needed a larger hospital, and so they were convinced that it was important to build something more than the I'm struggling to find the words to describe the old hospital. It was a hospital, but just barely.
It did. It met the basic needs, you know, for illness remediation, not so much trauma, not so much the ability to be the central hub of healthcare in the region that can either triage and treat or triage and ship out. It was a much lower level of care that was available just because of the size.
Yeah. More of like a glorified clinic or a large clinic, versus, you know.
It was a 44-bed hospital, though. I don't know how they got 40. Well, you know what? We shared rooms back then.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Bunks.
Well, it is when you look at the size of the homes back then, because the KRIM studio here, a home built in the late 1940s, and it had been added on to, I think, from the original building. So currently it's at just under 800 square feet, and there were full families that lived in here.
Sure.
So everything was more compact back then, including the hospitals. You don't really think about that. It's hard to, or I guess it's easy to forget that.
It is very easy to forget that.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yes. So, after I was born, you know, things continued on, and more organizations became involved because the needs became more sophisticated. So there was the auxiliary that was formed. There was the Payson Regional Medical Center. There were a bunch of different organizations that each took on their own roles within the organization. And Kenny, do you know when it was that the physicians group came in?
Between 1992 and 93, it was a process. It wasn't an event, but in that process, they had come together, and 5 of them signed on to. They'd come up with a plan. They knew it was going to be a very expensive plan. It was about a $15 million plan for expansion, and so they came together and said, we realize the town has been working for years to raise enough money to do this expansion, and we've raised, I think, $300,000.
I think it was 600,000 is what I read in the, yeah.
300, 600. The point was it was going to be a $15 million expansion,
And
after
what year was
years,
this again?
the early 90s.
Early
92 or
90s, so
93.
15 million. Wow.
Oh, 19, let's see. So what I have here is actually an Irs Determination Letter. So the IRS has reviewed the whole history of the organization and written an exhaustive multi-page letter discussing it and talking about how at each stage along the way that the nonprofit that Mogollon Health Alliance actually held, this EIN number, which is what they reference it to, each step along the way was meeting all of the qualifications for a nonprofit and operating not only well within their financial boundaries as a nonprofit, but also they extol the benefits heavily of our organization, the way that it was structured to benefit the community. So in this letter from the IRS, it was talking about 1997, I think it was, 1998.
97, 98 is once the process had collapsed.
Gotcha. And again, we're doing this Kenny and I are doing this as a forensic method of understanding because we weren't a part of it at that point.
Right.
So,
So in the early 90s, this group of doctors agreed to back the loan because there certainly were not enough assets in the community to build a $15 million facility or expansion of facility. They put some improvement in the clinic, but turned it into an admin building, and then spent $15 million expanding the hospital. What they didn't count on was the election that happened in 1992 and the evolution of national involvement in local medical issues. If you'll remember, Hillary Clinton had a commission on revising the healthcare delivery method in America. That commission made a lot of recommendations, but one of the things that came out was that HHS and Medicare, Medicaid suddenly had a lot more control of your billing processes, the appropriateness of certain procedures. They reduced the payments to rural hospitals dramatically in that window of time. And so between 92 and 95, the revenue stream that this group that had promoted the expansion of the hospital to a $15 million facility had counted on suddenly weren't there. Suddenly they didn't have the revenue stream they had in good faith projected they would have had. And so without that revenue stream, they suddenly got into serious financial trouble, which then leads us into the IRS letter that Jennifer is quoting from. At that point in time, they suddenly found themselves in serious debt with no ability to get out of that debt.
and as Kenny was talking, this wasn't just a local phenomenon. It wasn't like we had a group of people here that were visionary and stumbled. During this era in the late 80s, early 90s, it was extraordinarily common for physicians groups to be owning and operating hospitals, clinics, surgical centers, that type of thing. And it was because of exactly what Kenny said, the differential in reimbursement, not only amounts but also methodologies. That was the heyday of managed care, if you remember that, HMOs and all of that stuff. And so all of these, and I speak now not as what I know about MHA, but actually what I know in my professional life, in owning a clinic and working with physicians for the last 40 years. We have seen this whole evolution, and there was a lot of damage done to medical care facilities in that era financially because of this phenomenon where there was this popularity in physician-owned facilities, and at the same time a complete change in reimbursement. So it was really a double-edged sword for places all over the country, not just Payson.
So by 97, they were in serious trouble. They were literally facing bankruptcy. And so trying to find a solution to that problem was a typical Payson knockdown, drag out fight, probably along Main Street among other places. You know, I don't know if the cowboys whipped out their guns.
There we go.
All right.
Wonderful. And turn the mics down. That's important.
So now we're in the most recent quarter of a century of the history of MHA Foundation. And I'm just gonna, this is so succinct the way that they wrote it. I think that it really helps solidify the understanding of how all of these different organizations actually came together. So in this letter written by the IRS, it says, a number of the members of the PRMC Board of Directors decided that PRMC should continue in existence in order to improve healthcare and healthcare education for the residents of the local area. Now remember, this is after CHS came in. This is the year after CHS came in with a lease that relieved the debt burden off of this whole group of people. So they were looking at, I mean, the state was looking at closing the hospital, weren't they?
Yes.
So at that point, they've got this burden lifted, and they're trying to decide what to do with all of these entities and how to make things viable going forward. So accordingly, effective August 1st, 1998, the Payson Regional Medical Center Foundation, Inc., the former Section 501c3 fundraising arm of PRMC, was merged into PRMC under an Articles of Merger, with PRMC serving as the surviving corporation. In the same transaction, the Payson Regional Medical Center Auxiliary, an unincorporated association, also became a part of PRMC. PRMC's name was changed to Mogollon Health Alliance. Okay, So all three of those entities there were two mergers at the same time that
Mhm.
merged the three entities into one organization.
Wow.
And that organization holds the same EIN tax number. The Mogollon Health Alliance held the same EIN tax number as from the 1950s.
Wow.
Okay.
Wow. Wow.
So that's how it all came together.
Mhm.
Mogollon has kept the same, here it is, right in the letter. Mogollon has kept the same employer EIN as PRMC. And then it continues on to talk about other accounting things that aren't super exciting.
Well, they're exciting to me because it said this is basically the only way the operation
right.
could have continued.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it also says, the amended and restated Articles of Incorporation provide that Mogollon is organized and operated exclusively for charitable, scientific, literary, educational, and human purposes as provided in Section 501c3 of the Code, and specifically to promote improved quality and access of healthcare services for all community members, blah, 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 blah.
Mhm.
So this is how, there's a lot of nebulous understanding, and rightfully so, for how those original organizations finally settled out, shook out, become Mogollon Health Alliance,
Mhm.
and that then brings us to, that operation continued from 1998 up until 2015.
Mhm.
And at 2015, then we had another change again,
Mhm.
because that was when the lease was up.
Yes, and I tell you what, the community at that time, and even now, should be very thankful to that company, the one from Tennessee. I forget
CHS.
CHS for coming in and relieving a $17 million debt in the early '90s that the community was on the hook for.
In the late 90s, but you're right.
In the late '90s, sorry.
It would have certainly altered the trajectory of the community if we had to close the hospital and try to start all over again.
I actually
yes.
sat on the CHS board up
Mhm.
here, so I was on the board of trustees. I didn't become a part of MHA until 2018.
Mhm.
Believe
She's
it or
just
not,
a newcomer.
the entrenchment is very young.
Yeah.
So I was previously actually on the other side. So I was a part of the hospital, the CHS board,
Yes.
as all of these negotiations were going on, and also had the privilege of overseeing that hospital-based healthcare during those years. And I will tell you, just again to give CHS credit, their focus on quality of care and meeting and exceeding standards was phenomenal. During that time, we had in Payson great hospital-based healthcare. When the Joint Commission would come in and do their every 3 year, their surprise, we're here inspection. I think we had the last visit when I was on the board, I think there were literally 3 minor comments that they had. Out of their entire inspection of the whole
Of
hospital,
an entire hospital.
3 comments.
Wow.
Which is amazing. So on that level, they were very successful, but it came at a price. So
I also sat on that board because of my role with MHA, which Mogollon Health Alliance, as the successor in interest to Payson Regional Medical Center, PRMC with Payson Regional Medical Center. And so as the successor to PRMC's assets, which were the hospital, I sat on that board as an advisory member, non-voting advisory member. Actually, I think you and I probably overlapped on that board for a year or two. But one of the things that happened because I represented the entity that was Mogollon Health Alliance, I was watching CHS from a lessor-lessee perspective. And so I would ask questions about profit and loss and how much money they were making. What I would get were percentages.
it was a relative amount.
Yeah, we're up 3% from last year. We're down 4% from 2 years ago, but never any absolute numbers. We had in the lease agreement 3 years to negotiate a new lease. So from 2012 until 2015, we had a quiet period where we could talk to them and talk to others about what we were going to do about either extending the lease or selling the hospital to CHS, which was an option. And so at that point, I had an absolute right to start receiving that information about how much money, dollars and cents, they were receiving. And in 2014, the number came back that in the 17 years that they had operated the hospital, they had taken $181 million in retained earnings out of this community. That's 10, 11, 12 million dollars a year, $1 million a month. And so, as Jennifer said, they did that not by having huge volumes, they did that by having the highest price structure for procedures in the entire state of Arizona, and one of the highest in the western United States. So yes, we had an extremely high quality provider who did a marvelous job, but they did so at a premium price.
It came at a high cost.
Absolutely. Well, you know, I'm sure you can remember the conversations, you know, at the dinner table. Oh my gosh, I have to have this ultrasound of my knee. You know, if I have it in the valley, it's $350, and if I have it up here, it's $3,500. Well,
Yes.
that's how you do it. And it, you know, it is, you can understand when they come in that they need to recoup their upfront loss. But over the years, it would be nice to see a transition to a slightly more moderate pricing structure. So
as part of that negotiations in those, and they were pretty tense negotiations between 2012 and 2015.
I can vouch for that from the other side.
Yeah. They were less, at times they were less than cordial. I'm trying to be careful with the words I use, but we had some hotly contested meetings to say, okay, we understand what you're doing and we understand how you're doing it, but here are our goals as Mugian Health Alliance, the successor to PRMC. We want, number one, we want a reduced cost to the local patients, to the local citizenry for the services they're getting at the hospital. Number two, we want to see both the quality and the maintenance of the equipment in the hospital. We want that standard raised. We want not just to have old equipment maintained to a great level. We want new equipment. We want the new and the best equipment here and available to us for the prices that we're paying. And number three, we want to have a hospital board or an advisory board to the hospital that actually is listened to, because one of the things that we had observed in the years of being an advisor to that board was the PRMC board would come, they would meet with CHS, they would talk, and CHS would basically ignore them. I think the most important thing that board did in the years I was on there was decide what their sandwiches were going to be at the next meeting.
No, they fed us well.
Yeah.
It was the best hospital food you've ever had.
Yeah, there you go. So it would, but basically they would ignore, I mean, it was not a board that was giving them advice about the kind of health care needed in the community.
It was an oversight board, it really wasn't an advisory board. And I, you know, I don't know how it came to be, because again, I came in right at the end. And so I was shocked when I found out from the CHS side that CHS corporate operations were not actually going to be continuing in Payson unless we built a new hospital. So I, you know, again, this is an interesting parallel that Kenny was on one side of this equation at that time and I was on the other, and so our perceptions of what were going on, when you put it together, we actually have the opportunity to have a whole big picture. So it's pretty fascinating how it all evolved.
So we had a series of telephonic meetings, and then we started really in earnest about 18 months before the lease was to expire in 2015 with CHS executives. We would have the COO, the CFO, the corporate attorneys fly into Payson on their corporate jet and wine and dine us and tell us what great things they were going to do for us. And after 3 of those meetings, each one of them was the same thing. They would come, we would talk, they would not agree to anything. So we would have great dialogue and a wonderful meal, but we weren't making any progress. And so we notified them 6 months prior to the termination of the lease that we were going to be, you know, that we were continuing our discussions with them, but that we were giving them formal notice that we were also going to be having discussions with others about what to do about the hospital's future beyond the termination of the lease in 2015.
And that was when, to my understanding, that was when dialogue with Banner started because of a unique circumstance in the actual lease itself, because CHS had first right of refusal to continue to lease it, and the lease itself was fairly restrictive. Again, you're looking now 17 years later, so the board that took on this lease and were so grateful to have their debt relieved accepted a lease that was extraordinarily restrictive as a result. And so now we have different people, because boards change, in leader positions of leadership. And so within this restrictive lease, there were only just a very few people that were even, by people I mean hospital corporations, that were eligible to submit an offer. So Kenny, is that something that
Sure.
you can expand on?
And literally, we had a lawyer on our board, Richard Johnson, who was a retired lawyer on the board, and a couple of real estate agents, and so they poured over the 1997 lease over and over and over again. And Richard called me at about 11 o'clock one night and said, have you read section whatever it was, 12.1b? And I said, Richard's 11 o'clock at night, what are you talking about? He said, no, you gotta understand. Did you read it? I said, well, I'm sure I did, but what are you referring to? And he said, it allows for a hospital that is a nonprofit hospital, licensed to do business in Northern Gila County, to acquire the hospital without the first right of refusal that is associated with the rest of the offers that we've been receiving. So suddenly we had this pathway forward, and by the next morning it suddenly dawned on me, Banner was my hospital. I mean, they were my provider, my primary care physician was a Banner doctor here in town. They had a clinic here, and they were a nonprofit. So we made contact with Peter Fine, the president of the board of Banner, and said we'd like to talk with them. They met with us, they looked at the hospital, they came back with an offer, we made a counter offer. And again, the offer we made to Banner was had the same conditions we've made to CHS. Number one, we wanted to lower the cost to patients in Rim Country. Number two, we wanted to upgrade the equipment to to the 21st century. I mean, the equipment was old equipment. They had done a marvelous job of maintaining it, but it was old. And number three, we wanted to have a real advisory board, a board that could give input from the community into what and how the hospital ought to be operated. Banner agreed to those terms, and we began a negotiation that lasted for about 5 months. Cost $770,000 in legal fees, but we're able to get through most of the details. About midway through the process, I approached the two other members of the negotiating team. It was myself as president, Gary Cordell as vice president, and Rich Johnson as our treasurer. We're doing the negotiating, and I approached the two of them and said, I think this is great. I think we're making great progress, but one of the challenges that I'm looking at as the president of MHA, Mogollon Health Alliance, is we've been doing all of these beneficial things in the community over the years. We brought a dialysis center to town. We have a wellness home. We do these things. We spend millions of dollars. Where are we going to get the millions of dollars to continue those beneficial programs if we sign this agreement with Banner? Well, I was hoping Banner would step up and say, we have a big foundation, our foundation will pay for those things.
Because they do, and their foundation does amazing things.
It is, and it's a major foundation. So that seemed to me to be the way. So Gary and Richard went to negotiate with Banner to see what kind of options might be available. Richard came back a day later and sat down with me and said, here's what they proposed. Number one, they've said that their foundation has zero interest in taking on the many things that you do as a nonprofit to support your community. It's your community. They don't have control of that. They don't have input into it. They're not interested in doing that. Boy, my heart just kind of fell on the floor. And Richard said, but they said what they would do. since we've been making contributions to the community of a couple million a year, they'll put $40 million into a new foundation, and that new foundation can then use the interest off of that 40 million to take care of the beneficial things in the community, to the philanthropic giving, the support of education, support healthcare that they've been doing in the past. I was flabbergasted that Richard and Gary had been able to negotiate that, but that was the method that they came up with. Took it to our board. They started saying reluctantly. There was no reluctance at all.
Yeah.
They said, sure. But it created one more wrinkle in that Mogollon Health Alliance could not do that. So what we had to do in the spring of 2015 was split the assets that were in Mogollon Health Alliance into the hospital assets and non-hospital assets, leaving all of the hospital assets in Mogollon Health Alliance and moving all the non-hospital assets out of Mogollon Health Alliance into a brand new foundation called MHA Foundation. So in the spring of 2015, you had two entities in the town of Payson. You had Mogollon Health Alliance that owned the hospital, and you had MHA Foundation that owned all the other assets. We had our bank account and the significant property. We were one of the larger landowners in Payson. And so you had those two entities. Mogollon Health Alliance then merged with Banner and was absorbed by Banner. MHA Foundation, by virtue of this agreement, received the $40 million with the commitment to use the interest off of that $40 million to support the philanthropic purposes that we have here in the community. Part of the agreement also required a significant amount of money be spent by Banner improving the hospital, as I mentioned. So step one was taken care of. They had agreed to lower prices. We went from the highest prices in the state of Arizona for hospital services to one of the two lowest prices in the state of Arizona. So we accomplished that objective. The second objective was to improve the quality of the physical facility, which we were able to do. First, they spent almost $15 million in upgrades in the first 5 years, and they have a commitment to spend a minimum of $25 million improving the facility. They just had a meeting with the Community Development Services, the town of Payson. The current proposal, the current plan is to spend $46 to $48 million rebuilding the hospital, so it will be a state-of-the-art hospital. So step two was taken care of. Step three was, how do we have a meaningful advisory board? And Jennifer sits on the MHA board now, so she sees that once a month the CEO of the hospital comes to our board and wants input. So we serve as a true advisory board to them. As an example, during the course of the last year, Hoyt said, we have a problem. One of our staffing people, Heather, different Heather from our Heather, has indicated that our mammography machine is an old 2D machine. It's it's 20-some years old. It's in good shape, does what it said it would do, but it's a 2D machine. It's like taking an old black and white photograph. And we need a 3D machine like other communities.
So the difference between a 2D and a 3D is like the difference between an X-ray and an MRI.
Yes.
With an MRI, you get all of these slices. With an X-ray, you get one slice.
One slice,
basically. So
So based on that input and exchange back and forth, we made a substantial contribution. The employees of the hospital made a contribution, and Banner matched that to be able to put this new high-speed 3D mammography machine in the hospital. So we truly have a give and take with the hospital. We have discussions. It's not just, I'm here to report to you and you have no input.
Right.
Literally, they seek our input on solutions
And
to
not
problems.
only that, but we are, as evidenced by the 3D mammography, it's not only ancillary ways that we're able to positively impact health in Rim Country, but also directly with the hospital still, because we have that relationship, the two-way street.
Mhm.
So it's really great that, you know, we have this connection to our roots as the original owner of the hospital and the original founding group for the hospital, but we can still continue to contribute in that same exact direct fashion.
Mhm.
And that's just such an honor.
Yes, I'm sorry, but you're going.
And I think because the nature of our board, we have a broad representation of people who've been involved in the community for decades, people who have, young people who have children, people like Jennifer who have a great history here. So we have a really broad spectrum on our board that truly can be a sounding board for the hospital.
And
Mhm.
there's some medical experience too, and
Yes.
a lot of business experience.
Mhm.
So.
And there was a question, I think some of the questions, somebody, Sue Danny, who had a few questions, and some of them I believe were answered, but with who owns the hospital. So Mogollon Health Alliance and Banner, there was a merger between the two, and Mogollon Health Alliance was absorbed into Banner.
Right.
And
So-
so Banner Systems, Inc., which is the parent of Banner Patient Regional Medical Center,
Mhm.
owns the physical facility now.
Yep. Then the next question was, what does MHA and the Alliance, I'm not sure if reference to Mogollon Health Alliance, I believe so, but have to do with the hospital? And you did a great job explaining that MHA Foundation received the $40 million to be used, the interest off of that to be used to continue the programs, community programs that the Mogollon Health Alliance had been doing for many years, and to even build on that, because you've built on that so much, and that's a whole other program that we've gone into a little bit
At
on,
length.
on previous programs. And then there's the advisory board, that capacity, so there's a real partnership between MHA Foundation and Banner to help meet the needs and the growing needs, the changing needs of the community. You have the voices on that advisory committee. I believe Dr. Michaels is one, yourself, other members of the community that are involved in healthcare, that are rooted in this community, that are working with Banner, and there's that continued partnership.
I think it's really important too. One of the things that I've read is, why didn't you take the $60 million offer from Dignity Health? Well, first of all, Dignity was not a qualified offer because they were not a nonprofit doing business in Gila County.
Yes.
So
yeah.
Dignity is a great hospital system. I work with them professionally,
Mhm.
but they were not qualified. So A, it was not actually an offer, and B, it would have been a minimum of a $20 million lower offer when you look at the total combined contribution that Banner
Yeah.
has made to the community. Not
Mhm.
just MHA Foundation, but to the community
Mhm.
by bringing in new capital investment, buying new machines, buying new equipment, and then also, of course, contributing the $40 million for the corpus for our board to be able to continue our philanthropic work,
Yep.
plus also the $46 to $48 million expansion of the facility.
Yes.
So when you look at the total package,
Yep.
which that's extraordinarily important, and it's information that a lot of people, without a discussion and a dialogue like this, there's no way that it could be understood. And so that's why we really wanted to come on and just be really comprehensive in a short period of time to cover, 3/4 of a century of history for the hospital, for Mogollon Health Alliance, and then MHA Foundation.
So if you look at it from the perspective of the town, independent of MHA Foundation, the town received a hospital that's now going to be a brand new hospital. So if you look at what Banner put into, we'll call it the hospital function, the healthcare function, the initial cost to them was about $12 million to pick up the cost of equipment, et cetera, that CHS had put into it. Another $15 million they've expended to date, plus the $46 million that they're $48 million that they're going to be putting into the hospital. The community has now a facility where Banner has invested some $70+ million in the community to benefit the community, the hospital healthcare function in the community, some $70 million. And in addition to that, the $40 million that they gave us as a corpus, we've spent $16 million in the intervening 6 years on community benefit programs, and now that corpus is up to $65 million. So
Wow.
we've grown the group, we've grown the foundation's core value by 25 million, over and above the 40 million that we started with, and we've still spent $2.5 million a year.
I think this is going to be a really bizarre statement, but I think the IRS actually said it best. In their letter, they summarize the initial combining into Mogollon Health Alliance as, this transaction furthered your exempt charitable purposes by enhancing services available to the community.
Yeah.
And so through these different boards, all through these years, working so hard to do just their best, we're just lay people doing our best, but all through the years, all these people that are dedicated and passionate about making it the absolute best, all these organizations came together to become Mogollon Health Alliance, and then Banner coming in, and us being able to be MHA Foundation. So that's...
Yep. And then there was just, there were a couple questions, but they were really, it's all about the same, or it all revolves around the same, and being on multiple boards. Also, one to point out, this person believes that you're on town council.
Oh, wow.
But Jennifer Smith is not on town council. Kenny Evans was a former mayor of Payson, so he was on town council. Yes.
I should point out that there are, most folks on council typically are on nonprofit boards.
Yes, and that's where a question of conflict of interest being on different boards. What you find is there are most people, as you said, that are on boards are on multiple boards. Sure. Because that's what they want to do. They want to serve on multiple boards, and it's hard to find people to serve on the different boards. So you have people that maybe serve on the Habitat Board, the Humane Society Board, the Senior Center Board,
Sure.
As well as nonprofit.
Nonprofit. And
By the way, I do not serve in any capacity on any other board other than just MHA as president. I'm not sure where that came down, that I was on 3 boards, but I'm not,
never have been. Different organizations and involved with different organizations. I think that's what you find. And I was talking with somebody here, and 11 o'clock, so we have to wrap it up. But in a community like this, and as you pointed out, it's always been a tight-knit, strong community. And people that move into the community, maybe from a larger area, a city, or a place where you don't have that same level of community, and they say, wow, there's people that are on these different boards, and there's a good old boy network, or there's, some hanky-panky going on, whatever. That's community. That's how community works. You have people that are serving in on multiple boards in different areas in different capacities. And that's what a small community does to get things done.
Well, because in a larger community, you can have the 80-20 rule where 20% of the people do 80% of the work. But in a smaller community, it's more like the 95-5 rule.
Yep, so if you have a 95-5 rule, that 5 is going to be on
There's
multiple
gonna be some
boards and
overlap.
committees. And
Exactly.
there it is.
Well, and
Yeah.
interestingly enough, none of us get paid. We're all volunteers.
Yeah.
We get the privilege of putting money into the process.
Yep. Thanks for a comprehensive explanation of hospital ownership, Sue. You're very welcome. And thank you so much to you, Kenny and Jennifer, for being on today. Thank you guys for watching. We need to get out of the studio so DJ Pammy can get in here and get on the radio.